Hi, my name is Kaitlyn O'Gara, and this is the February 2017 topic analysis for Champion Briefs. The topic published by the NSDA for the 2017 February topic is Resolved. The United States should lift its embargo against Cuba. Now, first of all, there should be nothing about definitions when it comes to this topic. It's pretty clear the United States is going to completely lift the embargo against Cuba, which includes taking off every single part of the embargo, not just what President Obama has done thus far. This is actually a pretty popular topic. It received 81% of the student vote, and most topics usually don't get that much support. And that's because this topic is not only really pertinent to what's happening in the United States and the international community, but it's also really important with the election that just happened and the different policies that are going to happen, especially with the new administration, as well as what the international community has been going through every single year when it comes to the Cuban embargo. So, of course, there are very easy reasons to see why the Cuban embargo has been good, has been bad. But first, we need to look at the background as to why the Cuban embargo was put in the first place and why it was believed that we needed it at all. So essentially what happened is it's a commercial, economic, and financial embargo that was posed simply by the United States. This was a unilateral embargo. There was nothing that was happening in conjunction with the rest of the international community. And it was imposed first in March of 1958, and then was further expanded in October of 1960. So this was at a time where we definitely didn't approve of anything that the Cuban regime was doing under Fidel Castro, or doing at all under the previous regime that had existed, which was the Batista regime. And we disapproved of the way not only that they were treating their people, but also who they were selling arms to, and also who they were deciding to act with. And so because of all of this, the United States slowly in the 1960s started including more things under the embargo. In 1962, it included all imports were then banned under the embargo. In the 1990s, President Bill Clinton expanded the trade embargo further by not allowing foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies to trade with Cuba. There was no ability for the United States citizens to travel to Cuba, and there was a full embargo placed by the year 2000 after the Clinton administration had finished. There has been no physical blockade of the country by the United States. After the missile crisis that happened in 1962, this was simply an economic and commercial embargo to prove that we were not going to do business with a country that was going to be treating its people the way that no government should be treating its people. It wasn't just the human rights. The United States holds $6 billion worth of financial claims against the Cuban government. The pro-embargo position was that the U.S. embargo was a good response to these claims. Like the idea that there was no human rights and that the government wasn't treating our money correctly, that the government was corrupt because they weren't using the money for the people. But there was also the argument that we were only really hurting the citizens because the government wasn't changing, the government wasn't adapting, it wasn't treating its people better after the embargo. The people were just suffering as a result of the embargo. So today, there still is the inability for American businesses to conduct trade with Cuban interests in Cuba. And the only things that have really changed because of President Obama's work is that there are some parts of the embargo that have been lifted and U.S. citizens can now travel and purchase things in Cuba, which is pretty big. We also reestablished our embassy there, which previously had been like a haunted house for half a century. The problem with the unilateral Cuban embargo was that the UN General Assembly since 1992 has disapproved of the embargo. So 1992 was 30 years after we had first instituted the embargo, and we had decided that 3 decades later we were going to keep it. But the UN General Assembly disagreed. They believed that was a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. They believed it was a violation of international law. And in 2014, that was the first time that every single nation agreed with the UN. And there were, in fact, 188 countries that voted for that resolution that year. But the U.S. And Israel voted against it, and then 3 different Pacific Island nations abstained. There have been times where we have been tested by the international community to see why the embargo still exists. Why are we the only ones voting or abstaining from the UN resolution? And so that brings us to the reason why the embargo still exists today. And that's because we still disapprove of the regimes that exist there. The biggest problem that we had with Cuba was that they weren't treating their people properly, and that the government was shifting not only toward too close of a relationship with Russia, but also was communist. And we didn't approve of the way that they were conducting business and the way that they were conducting anything within their own nation. And so today we look at what's currently happening, and we look at whether or not the regime has changed. Now, in the last year, a lot has actually changed, because we have to understand that Fidel Castro is no longer even in charge of the government or able to control his brother. It is now simply Raul Castro. And so this is the first reason as to why the Cuban embargo should be lifted, is because it rewards the new Cuba administration. The United States has not changed the embargo in over 9 years at all. There has been no changes. But in those 9 years, so much has changed. Not only was Fidel Castro becoming more and more ill, making it more possible for Raul to implement different changes, but Raul Castro is an entirely different person than his brother. This is because, first of all, his goals differ greatly, because he no longer is trying to look at the past mistakes that were made by the previous administration and try and admit that those were okay. He's now looking at those mistakes and trying to correct them, because he recognizes what his brother did was not the way that the country should have been run. Now, of course, Castro, the new Castro, is not a perfect leader. It is not a perfect regime, and in no way should the affirmative be trying to stress that Raul Castro is the solution to all our problems. But it is easy to see that Raul Castro has already distanced himself greatly from Fidel, and that he's been changing his policy as the United States asks him to. He's been more cooperative with President Obama, he's been more cooperative with the United States, and he's been trying to find ways to get the embargo lifted by taking the steps that we had asked them to take back in the 1960s. It's clear that Raul Castro is the best reason as to why we need to be lifting the embargo, because the administration differs greatly from why we existed there. But also, on the negative, should be stressing that there is no guarantee that these changes will be drastic enough. There is no guarantee that Raul Castro will begin treating his people like we had asked Fidel to in the 1960s to the 1990s. There is no guarantee that the people of Cuba are going to get the human rights that every single citizen of the international community deserves. There is no guarantee that Cuba will change the way that their government works. And these are all questions that definitely need to be stuck to the affirmative, and that the affirmative should be answering if they choose to try and reward Raul Castro for the work that he has done. Within Cuba, first is the first branch of looking as to whether or not the embargo should be lifted, before then looking as to the effects outside of Cuba. So first, now that we know that the administration is different, and now that we understand exactly why there are reasons why the embargo could be lifted, we need to understand specifically within Cuba why it would be beneficial. Now, not only are there human rights abuses that are still occurring, or human rights abuses that have also decreased, which is stated in multiple of the Champion Brief's arguments, but there's also little things that have been impacted the citizens of Cuba greatly. First was food and medical care. Now, although the medical care in Cuba is substantially better than we would have thought, and they have surpassed many of our abilities, there also is a lack of exports to Cuba within the medical field, which has prevented people from getting vaccinations for cancer or treatment for other illnesses. It has caused especially the poorer citizens of Cuba to suffer the most under the embargo. But not only that, but there's been a lack of food that has been sent to the country, and a lack of purchasing power that the poor has in order to even buy food. This has decreased Cuban life expectancy and has created massive nutritional deficits from the embargo. It's really important to recognize that when we say the people of Cuba are suffering, we mean it. When we say that the people of Cuba literally do not have access to things that they need to live, that is a very good reason to evaluate whether or not the embargo is worth it. Of course, there is the time to recognize that the people within the borders and the government are going to have a different mindset of the United States should we lift the embargo. And the negative should be stressing why this is inconsistent. America has always been inconsistent with their actions to the embargo, besides a few of the steps that were taken between Obama and Raul Castro. The United States has not lifted restriction on Cuba for any particular reason, nor have they tightened it recently for any particular reason. In fact, the embargo has just pretty much stayed almost the same since 1962. And it's hard to justify a policy that has existed since 30 years before I was even born. It's hard to justify a policy that was supposed to create this massive government change that really ended up doing nothing. It is absolutely critical to recognize that the embargo has been around for this long. Whether on the negative or affirmative, you either need to be stressing that this is an outdated policy or explaining why this outdated policy works. Because either we lift the embargo and we're inconsistent, or we keep the embargo and nothing happens. These are the two things we have to weigh between. But also, we notice that human rights have not been getting better in Cuba. And that's really important. Because although the embargo was meant to change conditions that the Cuban people lived in, it failed miserably. And that's something that the affirmative, in my opinion, needs to grasp. The Cuban embargo is not perfect. It did not do anything practically that we wanted it to. But lifting the embargo removes the excuse that the government has. Because currently, Raul Castro can say, well, the reason we don't have medical supplies and the reason why you don't have food is because the United States is blocking it. But that's not entirely true. In fact, there are a lot of ways that exist in the international community for Raul Castro to get these kinds of things that the United States is not providing, but he doesn't do so because he uses the United States as a scapegoat for the problems that exist. And it's time that Cuba finally faces the problems that are within its own borders. There's two ways to do that. If you're on the affirmative, you believe that the embargo still can be used, that the embargo is still beneficial because of the way the government acts. But the negative should also be stressing that the United States embargo should not be an excuse as to why the situation is bad. But that's the first branch as to why we should be understanding that there is benefits within Cuban borders to lifting the embargo and why there are massive impacts. But outside of Cuba, there are three key reasons as to why the embargo has been contested about being lifted. The first is because Cuba has a lot to offer the international community. Lifting the embargo actually will improve emergency preparedness. Now, when the earthquake occurred in Haiti and the many countries were rushing to aid, trying to send not only money but also aid through their government, Cuba tried to do the same. Cuba wanted to supply money to Haiti. Cuba wanted to even supply money to Washington because they understood that that there were a lot of situations happening, a lot of natural disasters that we couldn't afford, that we necessarily weren't able to help out with. But the United States said no. Now, Cuba is in the perfect path to be hit by multiple different kinds of natural disasters. They are one of the most prepared countries despite the financial situation that they're in. And they should be able to help other nations, and they should be able to be a responsible member of the international community. But that only happens if we lift the embargo. That only happens if we cooperate when responding to international emergencies. But the United States mindset with Cuba might actually be the problem. The United States might not ever be able to see Cuba as this kind of international responsible leader because of all the things that have happened in the last half a century. And that's what the affirmative needs to prove, is that this mindset is only because of the embargo, that it disappears with the embargo, that the two are forever linked. Because Cuba, medically and through emergencies, has a lot to offer the international community. And the international community recognizes this, and this is the second reason as to why the outside community would be impacted. And that's because lifting the embargo is what the international community wants. So earlier I mentioned that the United Nations is always trying to put out this resolution that says that they disagree with the embargo and that it should be removed, and that the United States is violating international law. And the United Nations continues to condemn what is supposed to be the cornerstone of our foreign policy, something that is supposed to be one of the biggest things that the United States has ever done. But it wasn't until 2016 that we came to realize that there was a problem, and instead of voting against this resolution, we finally amended it enough to the point in which we could abstain. And now it has pitted the United States ambassadors and executive branch against the government that passes legislation, against the legislative branch. Because now we have the executive branch saying, look, we disagree with this policy, but Congress won't get rid of it. And Congress saying, well, look, the executive branch isn't listening to us and we're not cooperating on everything we need to be cooperating on. It has been a disaster to see that the United States government has been torn apart trying to vote on this UN resolution. And it's not okay that we seem so divided. We need to lift the embargo because the international community and the executive branch realize that there's something wrong with the way it's been instituted. but also we have been collecting support from Israel as to why the Cuban embargo should exist. And this isn't beneficial because it shows that Israel, which is one of our many allies, the only ally that actually agrees with us. At the point in which the rest of our allies are willing to say, no, we don't support you in this, that's something that's important to recognize. Removing the embargo could potentially improve ties between the U.S. and Cuba. It could potentially improve ties between the U.S. and the UN, between the UN and Cuba. And all of these things are possible. The question here depends on whether or not two things. First, whether or not embargoes and sanctions in general can be successful. Second, whether or not the Cuban policy is too outdated. These are the two questions that, in my opinion, definitively need to be answered by the affirmative and by the negative. That is your job in this debate. It is to prove whether or not sanctions work and whether or not specifically this sanction still has potential. Because if sanctions don't work, then obviously this one doesn't have potential. But if sanctions work, could the Cuban embargo still be successful? I think that there's legitimacy on both sides. I don't think it's going to be easier to be affirmative or negative in this debate. I think that there is a lot of statistical evidence to prove whether or not Raul Castro is going to be effective with or without the embargo. Remember that it is also really important on this resolution to be using evidence that isn't from organizations that typically have a political bias. Do remember that there are sites that are going to support what Congress has done by not removing the embargo because they're Republican-based, or they're going to support what the executive branch does simply because they are democratically based. This includes the Heritage Foundation, which has published a lot about why the embargo is good. So just be mindful of that because you don't want your evidence being turned around because there's a lot of unbiased evidence that exists out there. Feel free to use evidence from the 1990s. Feel free to use evidence from the 2000s to explain what has happened over the last 50 years. This foreign policy has been muddled almost beyond repair. No one really understands what the goal of the Cuban embargo is anymore and whether or not it can even achieve that goal. It is your job, as the affirmative, to prove that the goal can be reached. But it's your job as the negative to prove why the policy has failed the last 50 years. I wish you the best of luck in debating this February. I wish you the best of luck with these judges because February is a very big tournament month. There's a lot of different things happening on both the West and the East Coast. For West Coast, Berkeley is one of the last tournaments that exists out here in February. And for East Coast, there are tournaments that are happening almost every single weekend. It's going to be a big month. It's going to be a difficult month. And I hope that Champion Briefs has helped you get just one step closer to unleashing your champion.